Welcome back to another video, and in today's video we're going to cover a back offset strategy that I briefly mentioned on Instagram and had a decent amount of interest in it, so I want to give a little bit more of a full breakdown. And what that is actually reascending on your back offsets into basically another top set, maybe not as intense or maybe just as intense as your first top set, but basically reascending up. I think the general protocol that we see is we might have a top set and then some type of percentage drop. Maybe it's a 10% drop, or maybe it's it's just percentage based where it's a set weight, versus actually reascending back up to another set that's at a decent level of relative and peak intensity. So I want to lead by stating in no way did I come up with this. This has been around for a while, and this isn't some magical new formula that I'm inventing. This is something that I've just found a bit more use for lately, and for specific reasons. And that's, if you watch my videos, that's a big key to a lot of my videos, is not only, okay, here's a concept that we can use, a programming strategy or technique strategy, but here's why this is working and who this is working for, so that you can be able to take this and understand where the application would work, either with yourself or if you're a coach with your athletes. Second, this is going to be a small blip of an entire video I'm going to do on powerlifting now in the future, likely early 2024, regarding the full guide to programming back offsets in regards to all the different strategies, reasonings why, how we're going to be able to do it, whether it's percentage-based drop, percentage of your training max, RPE, different strategy between ascending sets, step downs, all the kind of different stuff that's going to be a lot more inclusive, probably a two-parter and a 2 to 3 hour in total video. But it's just a small snippet of that to really talk about strictly ascending back offsets, how to program them, and how they're going to be useful. And if you're wanting a little bit more of a breakdown too of kind of the thought process behind back offsets and what we're trying to accomplish, I do cover that in my programming series part 2. I believe it's called Absolute and Relative Intensity. You can check that out, and I kind of go into the thought process about like what happens fatigue-wise during back offsets and why we're trying to plan them accordingly based on each individual lifter. And you're going to see that a bit more when we get to the practical application towards the end of this video, when I show the actual fatigue application and how that's kind of plays out in regards to like a percentage drop back offsets versus this ascending model. So what are the reasons I would program ascending back offsets for a lifter? And this isn't all encompassing, but there's 4 reasons I really came up with that I think are the main ones that I look at for where I think there could be utility in programming ascending back offsets. The first and probably most important reason is when we need a little bit more average intensity on our back offsets, and by ascending on those back offsets to instance another somewhat heavy top set, again, it gives a bit more intention, focus, and motivation for the lifter, versus a lot of times lifters are going to do their top set, they're going to back off 10 to 12% or just to a percentage-based back down, and they're just going to, I don't want to say they're going to sandbag, but they're just going to kind of go through it without the same intent that they had for that top set, versus if we reascend to another set, they're likely going to put a lot more intent and focus into that, knowing that they are going to have to work up to another set where they're going to have a decent level of not only physical exertion, but also mental exertion to execute properly. And as a coach for the athlete, I very well may call this a second top set. Even though it may not be to the same intensity and maybe even to the same priority, I might frame it as a second top set because there's just a verbiage to saying that where people mentally are going to take a top set more serious. So if you let them know, I want you to work back up to another top set, albeit maybe a slightly less RPE, they're likely mentally going to approach that in a different state than if they're just doing a 3x5 at the same weight backed off 10% and not really thinking too much of it. The next reason is you will see with some lifters after they do a top set that their first back off set really is their worst one. And you almost see over like a 2 to 3 back off set progression that each set actually kind of gets better. And that it could be maybe they're not resting enough, or maybe just in some way there's an adrenaline dump and or some type of physical fatigue from that top set where they actually kind of need that first back off set to be lighter, and then they can build up from there for that. So this ascending set approach works really well because rather than backing off, let's say 10%, we're going to back off something like 15% for the first back off, which to them is going to feel heavy because of that exertion from that top set. Then we're going to go to like 10%, which is what their normal one would be. And then we're going to go even heavier to kind of average out the average intensity for that final back off set where they're really typically feeling the best. And you'll see kind of how that plays out in the model, but it works really well for the people who really kind of have a dump after that top set. The first back off is really underperforming and hard. And then we find that a lot of times they get better as the back off sets progress. With that being said though, sometimes you're gonna have that person who that first back off set is worse, and you don't see that progression through the back off sets for the reasoning that because that first back off set feels hard to them, they already mentally kind of check out that all of them are gonna be hard, even though if they were to take the appropriate rest times, that they're actually gonna find that those back off sets start to feel better set to set if they have the right mental attitude and approach to it. So again, utility where these ascending back off sets could be beneficial. The next big utility for using these ascending back offsets is when you're doing a fairly differing approach to the back offsets from the top set. So what I mean by that is maybe a decent rep change. Maybe you're doing a single on the top set, but then you're going to sevens, and that's going to be pretty hard to do an actual percentage drop from. Maybe you can do like actual training max percentages, but a lot of times rep work doesn't really pan out in the same way when you're doing training maxes because the disproportionate difference in their strength levels on higher rep stuff versus a single. So what you could do is, one, you could program RPE for those sets of 7. That's completely viable. Or you can do a reascending model on that rep work to build back up to another kind of rep top set after that single. The other example of a differing back-off model versus the top set is if you're changing variation. I mean, if you've watched some of my videos or some of my posts, you know I'm a big fan of doing like a comp squat top set versus like safety bar or high bar for the back-offs. And so you may be doing a comp squat top set of 3, but then back-off high bar pause squat 5s. And there's such a difference there that one, it would be very hard to do a percentage drop to know what you should be dropping from a comp squat to a high bar pause squat. And then two, you may have no idea what your high bar pause squat max is or what training max you should even go off to program those. So one, you could do RPE, or two, to get a better idea of kind of exertion when you might not even have an idea of what weight you should be doing, is doing that ascending approach on those high bar pause squat back off sets to basically work up to a top set on those again and be able to auto-regulate accordingly. And then lastly, of reasons why I would use this ascending back offset model, it would be somewhat lift specific. So on bench press, if you're familiar with some of my programming, I will tend to program a little bit higher average intensity on back offsets because people tend to be able to handle that on bench press. It's just not as fatiguing of a movement, and people tend to be able to maintain strength and not fatigue as much as they go through a multiple set workout. So with that, I very much, a lot of times if I want to increase average intensity, I'm going to bias towards a fatigue drop set model, which again, if you haven't seen that, I've talked about it in other videos and we'll for sure talk about it in a lot more detail in the Powerlifting Now video in the future. But for bench press, very well you could use this ascending set approach. I think it could work very well, but I think there's a lot of other things we could do as well that people could tolerate pretty good because they're not going to have as big of a drop off on bench. The opposite end on deadlift tends to be really fatiguing, and I have a lot of people that probably can't work back up to another top set after they do that first one just because of actual physical fatigue. So I'm not saying you couldn't do it with deadlift, but I'm all leading this to the fact that this is a strategy I find myself probably more often than not using on squat versus the other two lifts. It can apply to all of them, but squat seems to be the perfect approach here because people are very differing on the back off intensities they can handle on squat. You're gonna have some people like Ashton Roska, if you've seen Marcellus talk about his program, he takes massive drops on his back off sets. While there's other people who can maintain that work capacity through multiple sets. And so I find that squat is a good time to use this because it really allows a lifter to be able to auto-regulate accordingly to where they need to be based off of how they're gonna be able to perform back off sets. And maybe one, you don't know how you're gonna perform, so this allows you the ability to ascend up and figure out where that capacity is. Or two, it just kind of helps to keep you accountable and give kind of a strategy and guide of how to approach those back offs versus just hoping the 20% drop or the 8% drop you do is gonna be the right format for you. So now that we understand really my 4 main reasons of why I'm going to be programming ascending set work, one, for the intentionality and the focus that it's going to likely produce on those back off sets. Two, when we see a really big drop off from that on that first back off set after doing the top set. 3, when we're moving from one type of lift, aka a competition lift, to some type of variation or pretty big varying rep range where we might want to kind of reset our progression model and kind of where we're at. And then lastly, being somewhat lift dependent and likely where I myself find this likely works best. It can work on all 3 lifts, but just at least personally for me, I found a really good utility for squats. So now that we know that, let's actually get into the programming of it. And the first thing I want to say is when I'm doing this, I'm likely going to bias towards RPE. Because with this ascending set approach, it's very much an auto-regulated system. We could use percentages, but the thing I'd worry with there is as we work back up to another instance top set, is a lifter going to be able to maintain that same intensity? And if we program set weights, are they going to be able to do them to the proper RPE and kind of intensity that we're looking for versus those back off sets getting too hard? So I really find that this likely works best in an RPE approach. Within that, you very well likely, and especially myself, I'm always going to give ranges within that though. So the athlete kind of knows where they're shooting for and likely where they're going to be. And that could be ranges very much based on what I think they should do based off of their top set, or it could be ranges knowing that I think they're probably going to have a slight fatigue drop from that top set. So if they could have done X amount on their top set, if they did this set first, I'm going to lower it by maybe 2.5 to 5 kilos, knowing that because it's going to be the fourth set in total on the day, after 2 more ascending back off sets, that is likely going to be a little less. But either way, RPE approach for me tends to work best. So let's look at how this actually plays out now. So looking at just examples of how this is set up, I don't think this is mind-blowing, but I just want to give examples of kind of how this looks. So in this example of a variation where we're going from a comp squat to a high bar pause squat, in this example, we're doing a triple at 8 RPE, and then we're going to reascend back up on sets of 5. So it's kind of a double here. It's a double in the sense of high bar pause squat as well as a repetition change. And we're going to work our way back up within a rep range here. I give a little bit of an RPE range because that could be for multiple reasons, but a big reason I like to give RPE ranges sometimes is it gives a lifter a way to auto-regulate based on how they're feeling. If the back off sets are really going really hard, maybe, and they're feeling more fatigued, maybe they bias towards the bottom end, or maybe they're feeling really good, they bias more towards the top end. But either way, top set of 3, and then we take a decent back off here. This is probably based off of weight, a pretty good back off to where this is going to be a fairly easy set, and then reascend back up. Here's the rep change example, albeit this one had a rep change too, is we're doing a top set of 4 at an 8 RPE, and then we're going to send back up on sets of 7 with a 5 and a 6 RPE set and working our way back up. And then we have an extreme rep change where we have a single, which would be very hard to be able to dictate what you should do on sets of 8 if you're just doing like a percent drop from that top set. So instead, for these 8s, you can reascend back up to, in a sense, another top set at a 7 RPE. And then lastly, we have the multiple high-end intensity exposure. So this is literally doing a second top set here, where we do an 8 to 9 RPE triple, and then we're going to send back up to another 8 RPE set, which is going to be a pretty hard set. This very well is another top set for someone who might be able to handle that, where I do have people on squat that I think can very well do this, and this very well probably even has more utility in regards to someone on deadlift, on bench press, where we know they can likely handle multiple top sets, and this is a way to be able to reascend up to a set whether we just want to do it in general, or it could very well be applied to the fact of, okay, we're doing a top set on maybe tempo bench press, and then we're going to send back up for another top set on regular competition bench press because the tempo was somewhat of a movement constraint to basically hone in technique to then reascend back up to a comp bench set that uses what we learned and the good patterns we got from tempo to reapply here. So that could be another way we could be able to go about that. So taking this, let's look at actual fatigue accumulation. So as I already mentioned, if you have watched my programming series part 2 on the absolute and relative intensity, I kind of go about this model and showing what we're doing. So in this approach, we're just going to take, this is an actual lifter. I'm actually taking his exact numbers and how this played out. His program had a top set of 3 at a 7 to 8 RPE, and then he reascended back up on sets of 5 to a 6 to 7 RPE. And he very much tends to bias to that upper end of the range when we do this because he handles squat intensity really well. So what were his numbers? He did a set of 3 at 167.5 kilos at a 7.5 RPE. For the next set of 5, he did 137.5 to a 4 to 5 RPE. Then he did another set of 5 at 145 to a 6 RPE, and then another set of 5 to 152.5 at a 7 RPE. And so what I want to make sure to notate here as we get to kind of the estimated 1RMs and the fatigue accumulation is this isn't a perfect science. The fact is, 1, maybe he was feeling a little bit beat from the top set, so this set didn't feel as good. 2, with such a low RPE set, it's probably really hard to actually rate this correctly. And then 3, the whole point of this ascending approach is to create intention and focus again for, in a sense, another top set. There's very good chance he took this set with a little less intention and adrenaline, and then each set kind of ramped up to where this set felt the best again because of kind of the intentionality and the psychology approaching it. So we take these numbers and we do a estimated 1RM. If you look at this, it's just basically just taking if he's a 167.5 triple at a 7.5 RPE, that equates to 85%. So I'm just doing a little math there, and that estimates to a 197 E1RM. It's not meaning he can actually do 197. This is just for the intention and the focus of this model is looking at what is their estimated 1RM and how it affects things. So from there, we can see the drop here. As I mentioned, maybe there's not as much in focus here. One, hard to rate 4 to 5 RPE. I took this as a 4.5 RPE. And two, maybe he has some drop off after that top set. So 190, then he does this set, it goes to 190.5, and then he does that final set, and we get back up to 194. So we can actually see that final set was his best back off set and only had a 3 kilo drop from that top set. And we can actually calculate the fatigue accumulation. So here, if he does this triple, we're going to measure everything off of this 197. On this set, based off of the RPE rating, he had a 3.55% drop in strength based off of the estimated 1RM. Here he had another 3.3, but then on that final set, 1.52%. So the lowest and a very low difference, which again has a lot of different things that kind of entail. And this is going to all kind of summarize itself at the end here when I show the full example of a drop down versus an ascending set model on how we can kind of see this. But either way, we can actually calculate here the actual fatigue that he accumulated through this model and how his performance actually got better through those back off sets by doing this. With the same lifter again, here was another day. They had a comp squat set of 4 at an 8 RPE and then reascended back up to, in sense, another 8 RPE set, basically. Now, it was a little bit of an overshoot on this day, but that's fine. One set of 4 at 162.5 kilos at an 8.5. Then he did a set of 6 at 142 to a 6.5, and then a set of 6 at 152 to an 8.5. And so we can see here on the estimated 1RM chart, he did a set of 4 at 162, and that comes out at 8.5 RPE. That comes out to a 191 estimated 1RM. We see that same little drop on that set of 6, but then we actually see him match the same exact estimated 1RM with this set. So we literally got 2 sets to the exact same like strength level and stimulus, but with just a differing rep change here, which again, when we're going to see the next one, I don't think he would have gotten the same type of performance out of just a percent drop or a training max setup. So looking how this all comes together, this is again actually from this lifter, and this was going multiple blocks back before we started doing this approach. He had a top set of 4 at an 8 to 9 RPE, and then 4x4 with an 8% drop. And we're going to see multiple things here. So one, he did the top set of 4, 9 RPE. You can look at, I mean, these other days too. That's pretty well in line with kind of where he's at strength-wise. Good performing day. He then does an 8% drop to 152.5, does that to a 6 RPE. So for him, actually based off of this, he's not really having the issue of the fact that he's having a drop off on that first back off. So when we see this here, this is more probably intentionality / it's really light, so hard to rate RPE. I don't think he's getting this because he's extra fatigued after the top set. That's not the case. What we're seeing more is him being able to ramp up that intensity and focus back up to that second top set, basically. So we can see here, every set gets a little bit harder. And frankly, as we see the numbers, it gets a little bit disproportionately hard by this set. And that's a little bit of an issue. And this kind of tells me he actually, if we're looking at kind of like the diminishing returns on back off sets, this set was actually a little bit too much. And that's why you can see here, when we go back to his primary day, he only does 3 back offs now. So looking at this, how does this fatigue accumulation come out? So he does a set of 4 at a 9 RPE to 191. His first back off set is actually higher performing. That could be a multitude of reasons there. One very well could be just because of easier set and harder to rate RPE and whatnot. He has basically a reoccurring performance here, and then he has like a 1.5% drop off on that 4th set. And you can see here, pretty disproportionate drop here. You can see on all these other ones, he doesn't ever get down really into the mid to low 180s. Really, this one's probably an anomaly just because of a lower RPE set, but really most of his good sets are still tracking in that 190 kilo range. And so this was pretty disproportionately dropping off to where you can kind of tell if you're kind of calculating this, you can see this 4th set probably was a bit disproportionate in kind of his strength drop off and probably had diminishing returns at this point. But if we were to take this same exact day and move it into an ascending approach, what might we expect? So adjusted for the ascending approach, he still has the same top set RPE. And then let's take the same average intensity. Let's just, instead of doing 3 sets of 4 at 152.5, let's do 145, 152, and then 160. And the hope would be here, I mean, really this averages out to doing the same average intensity over 4 sets, just breaking it up to where we have a higher peak intensity here and an easier set here. So what I kind of expect here is that this would be 5 RPE, this would be 6.5, and this would be 8. And this would pretty much match what his top set would be. And we'd see less drop off here. Here we had a 1.57% drop off. Here we have a 0% drop off, which a large part is likely from that intense and focus, not literal drop off in strength. So we actually did this. What did it look like? Now, he did do a top set of 2, so it's not able to be perfect here, but it did a top set of 2 at 177 at 9 RPE, and that came to a 192.5 set. Then we reascended on 3 sets of 4. First one being 145. And again, this is just coincidentally happened that it ended up being a perfect setup here. I wrote this before I even saw that he had done this, and I was just like, oh, this is perfect. So he did a set of 4, 5.5 RPE, pretty well in line. A little bit more of a drop off, again, likely from kind of an intensity drop and knowing that this is pretty light, or just the fact that it's light and it's harder to rate that RPE. Set of 4 at 152.5. Perfect, spot on with where I was figuring, outside of the fact that it is a slight fatigue drop because this set was a little bit higher performing than the model here. But then look, he did 1 set of 4 at 160 at an 8 RPE. He pretty much almost matches and he gets that 191, and it's only a 0.78% drop versus here. If you're looking at this, he had a lower estimated 1RM and lower performance on this third set than when he did it on this model. So again, for this lifter, it's working really, really well in matching the same average intensity of these 3 sets, but having an overall better performance by that third set and almost matching his actual strength levels by that top set. So hopefully looking at that gave you a really good idea of kind of how this plays out on paper and actually the data behind it. We obviously went through the reasons why I might be assigning ascending set backoffs to a lifter and the reasons why that might be beneficial. We looked at the ways we can set that up based off of variations, rep ranges, or just a matter of using it for utility to make sure a lifter kind of keeps the mental focus and intention of their sets. And then really looked at that lifter and how that kind of played out when we applied that, looking at how the difference was when he did just the percent drop model versus the ascending set model, and how on paper it was a better quality workout for that lifter and was able to maintain a higher level of strength and hit a better peak intensity. I think I think it's probably an agreement that being able to go to 160 for 4 is going to be a better stimulus than just sticking at 152.5 for the entirety of the workout. Now, this doesn't work for everyone. Not everyone should be doing this, but I want to put this out there so people understand that this is a strategy we can use, when we should use it, and when we do use it and it's working, what it should be looking like and what we should be saying. So if you have any questions, make sure to comment below. Make sure to be on the lookout for when the full back off set guide comes out on Powerlifting Now. And until next time, peace.